Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as...
I feel like I've done something very much rooted in self-preservation. Being really straightforward about the Tourette, to me, is very much about protecting myself in my interactions with people. Because while there's a percentage of people who will be deeply unpleasant to me, even knowing I have a neurological condition, the majority of people are not. And when I can get the TS out of the way, I find that it sort of opens the door for people. People want to share in return, and sometimes that can lead to really awesome, richer encounters.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. Great response to last week's episode with 15-year-old Amelie from Ireland. You guys were really impressed with her and her sense of command and drive and eloquence, rightly so. Don't miss that episode. That was episode 6 of this season 7 of Tourette's podcast. My name is Ben. I'm one half of this weekly podcast about Tourette syndrome as it happens in real life. The nuance and variety of it, instead of the narrow and incomplete picture we so often get when it comes to portrayals shaped by the outside or non-Tourette world. I understand things have to be kind of sensationalized or heightened or made exciting for TV, but there's a whole other universe of Tourette syndrome missing from the dialogue. So that's what we talk about. And for the many new listeners who've come to the podcast this season, I have Tourette syndrome. I just turned 41. But most of my life, until my late 30s anyway, I kept my Tourette under wraps so nobody would make fun of me or make unfair decisions or judgments on my behalf. That's what I was scared of. And now the world for me right now is digging into my TS and being open about it and really trying to understand not only within myself, the Tourette, but also in context with the millions of other Touretters out there, all over the world, every populated continent. And so each week on this podcast, we pull one of them in from somewhere out in the world, someone with Tourette syndrome, and we record a long, freewheeling conversation about our lives and the things that are eerily similar about them, the way we think, and just to see what we can figure out. And along the way, there are all kinds of helpful bits of information for people who are trying to learn about Tourette syndrome or were just diagnosed, or maybe we're doing the same thing that I did with my life, which was to kind of, live in the closet with Tourette syndrome. And anyway, this is here to be a support, but also to educate, I think, in an interesting way. There's a Facebook group for the podcast, the Tourette's Podcast Discussion Group, which is run by the amazing and brilliant Sophia in the UK. And that's where you can ask questions of other people in the community to get advice or see how they would handle a certain situation. People all over the world participate there in the discussion group. And interestingly enough, one of the members posted a question the other day that actually sets this episode up perfectly. Total coincidence. I'm pretty sure she's okay with me saying her name here. Daphne just posted this in the Facebook group. She says, "Does anyone talk in a different accent from TS? I don't know if it's TS or one of the comorbidities, but I can't stop in the past 2.5 days with talking in a British accent." So this is to say that Daphne is not British, but she's talking in a British accent and is wondering, what that might have to do with her TS, or is this a tic or what? And that's interesting and timely because our guest on this episode does that pretty much full time. An American with a British accent. And he does explain this in context with Tourette and ticking. I'm definitely pulled into speaking in different voices. And in the echolalia kind of way, if I hear someone say something that has an interesting inflection or has a certain kind of syllable arrangement, I'm so urged within myself to repeat it and try to say it in the same accent. I challenge myself to say it. And I promise you, this is not in a mocking way or doing it in an offensive impression or, certainly not that, and not in that spirit whatsoever. Promise you, it's nothing like that. There's some brain stuff happening. And just like Daphne was saying, but with me, it's just these little moments, like little phrases I hear, and I just have to repeat them out loud. For our guest, Winter Tashlin is his name. It's steady. The British accent is here for the full episode, and we talk about that directly and how and why. Winter is a straight up joy to talk with. Just has a way with words and insights, and is someone I know I can learn a lot more from, actually. And we're probably going to do another episode with him in the future because there were so many other angles, so much untapped information. Winter talks about being queer and being a creative, has some wild stories from the airport, and he even broke his neck ticking. I'm not kidding. The guy broke his neck ticking. We do talk about times we've taken the initiative to get off the medications that we were on, kind of in context when, like in the 1980s and 90s, when we were both on very similar ranges of medication. And I have to say this, we only discuss that in the course of telling our stories, the part about getting off medication ourselves. As a listener, don't take any cues from us here. We're just sharing our stories and what we've done to explore Tourette management within ourselves and finding what's right for us as individuals contextually. And that's the point. Don't do anything without a serious talk with your doctor. This is not a medical advice show. We're just talking. One of the coolest things to me personally with this episode is that Winter and I were probably in the same room as one another at some point, maybe more than once in our childhoods, because we both attended Tourette Association conventions as kids or conferences. But we had separate trajectories growing into adults. This is kind of where we pick it up. I know you're going to enjoy this one. This is me talking with Winter Tashlin.
And I think we're just about the same age.
Yeah, I just turned 41 a few days ago.
I just turned 41 a few days ago.
When was your birthday?
June 10.
Okay, I was June 20. Okay, so you got 10 days on me.
In my case, I was symptomatic from probably about 8 years old, but I developed really noticeable tics at 13. And I was lucky in that my mom was a special education teacher.
Yeah.
And she got me in with a neurologist. Well, okay, so I had what used to be the really traditional Tourette trajectory. I started an eye doctor because I was blinking, and then I was at an allergist, and then because I was clearing my throat and stuff, and then I was at a chiropractor because I was rolling my neck, and then eventually I was at a neurologist at 13, and I was diagnosed at 13 with just as I was really starting to enter puberty, and I had pretty innocuous symptoms, and then at about 13 and a half, I started barking like a dog.
Oh, okay.
And that's less innocuous than having a head jerk and a sniff and a blink.
For sure.
And so, I mean, I've spent my whole adult life now presenting in various forms, but the very first public speaking thing I ever did was when at like 13 years old, my mother and I got up in front of my entire junior high school to explain what Tourette was and why I now barked like a dog. And then I continued to do Tourette presentations for what at the time was the Tourette Association of America, now the TAA. Mm-hmm. I did with my mother. I did a lot of like schools, like when a student in a school had TS, mom went in and did presentations, and I often joined her when I was younger. And we did we both presented the biennial conference a few times, some together, some independently. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've been talking about Tourette since relatively soon after I was diagnosed.
I think I was 5 or 6 when I was diagnosed, and my mom was really active with at the time, the TSA, the Tourette Syndrome Association. And so we would go to conferences and things like that. And I would meet, I would see kids my age with Tourette, which was really important for me to see, to have just kind of a sense of like, I'm not the only one. Then seeing adults, Steve Bachner, Shane Festel, people like that, who were, I really liked them as people. And I'm like, okay, these are cool adults. And it gave me a really great compass of, I think, like what my prognosis might be, so to speak. But after that's when I became like kind of shameful of the Tourette joke, and I was going to get made fun of or beat up or something like that. And I was going to, it's just the end of my social life if I start talking about it. So that's why I bottled it up, because I had these huge insecurities about it and just lived that way.
See, you and I must have met because I'm sure our mothers knew each other, because my mother was head of the education committee for the TSA and then eventually the TA for a long, long time, and was on the national board for a while.
It's very possible.
She was incredibly, incredibly active in the TSA. Yeah, it's weird. I still can't get used to saying TAA. TSA still sort of rolls off the tongue. And you and I are both also of the generation when the logo was deeply uncool. I mean, that original TSA logo was so bad. See, I come from sort of an interesting place with this because my tics were such that stealth wasn't an option for me.
Yeah.
And that's kind of funny because I very much was a very, very, very shy kid. I'm by nature rather introverted, and I've ended up sort of throughout my life having a career which is very outgoing. I mean,
yeah.
And that's because I learned to be personable and I learned to be funny as a sort of coping strategy for the Tourette. Like you can't be a wallflower if you're barking like a dog. So you have to learn how to be the center of attention for something else.
Right. Yeah.
And that was a challenge. Also, I should note, because we haven't said anything, that I'm American and my accent, if you want to call it that, is a speech atypicality tic. It comes and goes. About every 12 to 18 months, I'll go from sounding American, like a kid who grew up in Massachusetts, which I did, to sounding like this and back and forth.
When did that? So I don't want to divert from what you're talking about with your job, because I do want to get back to that, because all the things to say about that too. But when did that begin, and what did you make of it when it was when that was kind of setting on?
So I always had echolalia for speech patterns. Like I remember if I was watching TV in the other room, I would sometimes come out and my husband would look at me and say, "Oh, you've been watching West Wing." And I'd say, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because you sound like Josh Lyman right now." So if I watched British television, I would get sort of a mimicry accent pattern for a few minutes. And one day in 2006, I was watching Top Gear during the window when Top Gear was showed on American television.
Yeah.
And an episode ended and I sounded sort of like Richie Hammond, as I often did. And I sort of waited for that to go away, and it didn't. And eventually I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning and I went to say something and I still sounded like Richie Hammond.
Huh.
It was almost a received pronunciation accent. And then over the course of about a month, it shifted to sound basically like this. And I sounded like that the first time for about a year and a half. And then I started sounding, every now and then, I would start to sound American again.
Yeah.
Until it went away.
Huh.
And it's weird. I mean, at the time, one of my two partners had grown up in the United Kingdom for part of his life.
Mm-hmm.
So I often didn't want to explain about the accent because it's clunky and it's not the thing people think about when they think of Tourette, of course.
Yeah.
So generally I would just tell his life story. People would say like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'd say, "Oh, well, I used to live in Chiswick." And that would be it for most people.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I met an actual British person, I would always explain. And now I explain sometimes, sometimes I don't. But it is, of course, confusing as someone who has spent a lot of his life speaking for a living. It is very confusing. Someone will see me at a conference and I'll sound one way and they see me and I sound another way. And it just happened with my job. I got hired recently as an automotive journalist working for a YouTube company, Transport Evolve, that does reporting on electric vehicles and green transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And my very first on-camera appearance, actually my first two on-camera appearances, I sounded American. And then the accent tick happened, came back. And that's further complicated by the fact that the other two on-air personalities for the company are actually British. So I had to do a video for the channel explaining why I sounded like this, that I wasn't just adopting an accent to fit in or something. It was very weird.
Did you get a fire hose of questions after that?
I mean, I did a pretty comprehensive video. So we got a lot of positive feedback on that. And then for the next few videos I've done, there's always one or two people who are like, "Wait a minute, why does Winter sound like that? I heard him talking about Ducati motorcycles and he sounded American." And the nice thing with the video is I can just link to the video instead of having to go into an involved explanation. I can say, actually, I have Tourette syndrome. It's a speech atypicality tic, and I talked all about it here with a link. And just leave it at that.
And yeah, I'll definitely be linking to it in the show notes for anyone curious. But I have to ask though, in the event that you may have covered this part in the video, but does it make you feel? Do you have a different sense of awareness, or is there anything that feels different about your personality when you do shift into a different accent?
So I already used a bit of British colloquialisms because one of my partners had grown up in Britain. But I definitely find that I fall into the pattern of using British terms a little bit more. Yeah. The thing I find really interesting is that I'm more inclined to watch and listen to British media because I still have some degree of echolalia 4 accents. But taking on... So the thing that was hard to adjust to is that your face feels different depending on how you speak.
Yeah.
And I find that if I listen or watch a lot of American stuff, I naturally want to mimic that. And it makes my face feel weird as I'm sort of like the two tics are fighting each other between like, oh, does this tic continue or do I echolalia for the way this person is speaking?
Yeah.
But, it is very strange. Not as much now as it was in the early days of the tic. It is very strange being an American and being perceived as a foreigner.
What do you observe about them that seems like it's maybe them playing off of the accent tic?
Well, so I had to come up with an answer for what football team I followed.
Yeah.
And I was warned by one of my partners at the time who was like, don't make it Manchester United because Americans want to talk about Manchester United. So field press, I was saying, I follow Chelsea, which of course I don't. I have had people get angry at me. I had someone come up to me in a supermarket once and say, go back where you came from and stop taking American jobs, which was very funny as an American who was at the time unemployed.
Oh my God.
My favorite encounter was I had a young woman was checking me out at a supermarket and said, so are you like from another state or something? And I said, no, my accent is from England. And she paused and then said, oh, you mean like Austin Powers? Because I love him. And I said, yeah, just like Austin Powers. And I walked outside and my partner who had grown up in the UK was turning red. He said, like Austin Powers? Really? Like Austin Powers? But I mean, on the scheme of things, I bark a little bit less when I have the accent tic. And, as I say, I've never been thrown out of a restaurant for talking like someone from north of London. Yeah. And I've definitely been thrown out of a restaurant for barking like a dog.
Yeah.
And, compared to, I had very bad coprolalia when I was younger. Still have some. The story of how my coprolalia sort of went away is actually very funny. But, compared to coprolalia or barking, whatever, the accent tic is unintrusive. I mean, I broke my neck ticking. I snapped the C7 vertebra. I snapped the spinous process off my C7 vertebra in 2001 from a head jerking tic. I'd had a head jerk to the left at that point, since 1993. And I had what they call a clay shoveler's fracture, which is caused by over-musculature on one side of the neck and sort of underdevelopment on the other side, because it was always a tic to the left. So, I mean, in the scheme of tics, I've broken my neck. I've been thrown out of restaurants. I'll take sounding like a sort of British person 18 months at a stretch, in the scheme of things, it's pretty fine.
Yeah.
Confused the heck out of my mother the first time I called her with the tic. I say, hello, Mum. And she said, what the hell is this? And then she paused for 2 seconds and said, you're going to tell me this is a tic, aren't you?
Well, how, I guess growing up, did your parents regard you? And, so us growing up, we're both the same age. And I definitely remember the mid 1980s when, obviously very young at this time, but I definitely remember when I learned about Tourette syndrome, I didn't have it in the frame of reference of like, this is something that society thinks is weird or whatever. My parents were really cool and supportive about it, even though it was their initiation into it too. Because again, the mid 80s, this is not something that everybody kind of knows about at this point. So we're having to kind of learn it together. And but they were really supportive of me and cool. And my mom, just like your mom, was involved with the TSA. My mom, I think, was the state secretary for North Carolina. Or the chapter secretary. It was really cool having her involvement in just really initiating me into it and giving me a sense of universe, I guess you could say, just so I understand myself better and so I get to see other people. And how did your parents regard you? And, you know, when the newness of Tourette syndrome starts to appear, do you have any early memories of this? Was it kind of a crazy time, or was it, did it take, you had mentioned going to different doctors and things like that, but when it was setting on, what was the dynamic like in your family?
So, I mean, in retrospect, I was ticking well before I was diagnosed. Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, I remember my neck rolling before it was neck jerking drove my granddad absolutely bonkers. Mm-hmm. And my parents were very worried about my allergies. I'm also an asthmatic, so there's reason to worry about my allergies. But of course, I had all this throat clearing and grunting and stuff. You know, it's funny, my stepdad said to my mother a couple of years before I was diagnosed, he said that he thought I had Tourette. And my mom said, no, that's ridiculous, because my mom was a sped teacher and she'd had a kid with Tourette. And at the time, she didn't know enough to know that if you've seen one person with Tourette, you've seen one person with Tourette. So my tics didn't look like that kid's tics. So she sort of ruled it out. As soon as the head jerking started, my parents said, like, okay, this is clearly something is going on, like, it can't easily be explained away. And that's how I ended up at a neurologist. And I think the place where my parents struggled, because my parents were super accepting, very huge proponents of me doing all the things a kid normally did, you know, in terms of engaging in society. You know, we would go to a restaurant, my mom would pull the server or the host aside and explain about the Tourette when we got there. I now carried cards I made up for that exact purpose, you know, once restaurants are a thing again. And the place where my parents and I ran into trouble was medication. Yeah. Because I am now, pardon me, I'm now very much classified as someone who has medication-resistant Tourette. My body never reacted to the neuroleptic class of drugs in a productive way. And as you may know, I mean, back then, the sort of guiding idea of how you medicated for Tourette was you tried to medicate the tics away. Yeah. And today there's a much bigger focus on quality of life, but at the time there wasn't. And my parents were big believers in medical intervention. I mean, as am I, as a rule, I'm in favor of doctors. Yeah. But I mean, I was on at one point, this sounds so ridiculous, but at one time I was on Haldol, Orap, and Risperdal all at once, along with Ativan, because Ativan has anti-tic properties, and Clonidine, and Luvox, all at once, as they were trying to control the tics and OCD. And I was sleeping, 14-hour days. I put on, from the time I was diagnosed, so the day I was diagnosed, the doctor put me on Haldol, which in retrospect you would never do today, because all I had was a head jerking tic and a sniff. Yeah. They put me on Haldol, and from the day I was diagnosed, 365 days after that, I had put on almost 150 pounds.
Same story, man. We have the same story. I was on some variation of the list of drugs you mentioned. I didn't have quite so many at one time, but definitely Haldol, definitely, I think later Anafranil. What else was there? There was a bunch of stuff and some very heavy medications. But same thing, when I was maybe 14 and I put on so much weight. I've always been like a little kid, like a very small, slender, small frame. And out of nowhere, within a 2-year period, I put on lots and lots of weight. And it really delivered a shock to me. I think there's self-esteem, but there's also just like, what the heck is happening to me? Who am I?
Right.
I don't feel like myself. And, because it wasn't just the weight gain. It was all kinds of other effects that were either maybe me playing off the self-consciousness of my weight gain, or there were other things just directly from the drug in my brain that just made me want to give up, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I think about this huge list of medications, and I occasionally talk to people today who say like, oh, I was just diagnosed and they want me to start, a medication. I always say like, the modern guidelines are to look at quality of life, because of course I was on all these drugs and I was still ticking terribly.
Yeah.
And as a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid, you're self-conscious enough about literally yelling about flying penis man, because I had a couple A tick about flying penis man. My couple A was very weird, and barking like a dog, and I've got this head jerk, and I'm really heavy, and I'm queer. Like, it was a whole sort of it wasn't. Teenage years were not the best. And then about 17, I had sort of gotten through puberty in retrospect, and around 17 I hit this really hard waning period, and my tics got much less severe, and I wanted to go off medication, and my parents said, absolutely not, you can't go off medication before going to college. And I went to my doctor at the time and said like, look, I want to go off my meds. And she said, that's going to be an involved process if you're going to do that. And I said, Mom and Dave don't want me to. And she said, you're 17, you're almost 18. If you want to do it, here's the condition. She said, like, look, you're a teenager. You're going to do this whether I tell you to, or not. She said, so I'm going to give you permission to go off your medication on the condition that you do it perfectly following my guidance, and the school nurse at your school knows and is willing to collaborate on the process. I was going to a small therapeutic day school at the time.
Okay.
And the school nurse agreed, and my doctor, I was seeing Ruth Bruin in New York at the time. And we very slowly, over the course of about 6 months, weaned me off almost all of my meds. And we didn't tell my parents until my mom got very concerned at my weight loss and was afraid that I'd become anorexic. And at that point, I disclosed that actually I was almost not on any medication anymore. And she was not happy at all. But at the same time, I think she was kind of proud that if I was going to do it, I did it like appropriately. I didn't just say like, I'm going to stop my meds. I, talked to the doctor and followed all the doctor's instructions. And at that point, I could relay to her that actually I'd had problems going off some of the meds. At one point, we'd had to stop and greatly slow down how I was weaning off one of the meds, and I'd taken care of all of that myself.
I stopped cold turkey, so to speak, with, I can't remember, I think anafranil was the sort of the final straw for me. And I might have been roughly that age. I was maybe 16. I hate everything was basically, I think kind of my look at everything was just, there's nothing making me happy. And I just feel like like a rock on the floor or something. Maybe if I do something a little bit different and shake things up, and if I go off my medication and it has some sort of like, really hard slap back effect on me, then who knows? Maybe that'll put me in some different headspace and things will be better. I was just trying to really kind of rationalize my way of like, there's a way I can do this and get off of this and be better, even though it was completely unknown. But and in discussing this, I got to say, for anybody in the audience, this is not like follow our advice of what we're talking about. This is, like, talk to your doctor. This is not us saying, this is something you should do. But
no, definitely talk to your doctor.
Right.
No matter what medication, I don't care what medication you're on or for what purpose. Talk to your doctor before you make changes.
Yeah. I have no credibility or license to talk about any of this except for just me talking about what I went through. But I going off of it, definitely, especially anafranil in particular, because it did have some other effects on me that were pretty much permanent biologically. And once like stuff that really, I think, damaged my psyche. But once I got off of it, I think just the fact of feeling like I was off of it and doing more my own game, that felt good. And then I got a little bit more motivated to, I think, beat any of the fears that this was a terrible idea for me to be off medication. And I worked out a lot and I lost a lot of weight and I started looking better and feeling better. And this was all, I think some sense of energy that I harnessed that I have not been able to harness ever since, like a level of motivation that I'd never had before. And feeling, just feeling better about my talents and being out in the world and connecting with people. And I guess this sounds like a dumb way to say it, but almost feeling like a normal person for a second, even if I'm still highly self-conscious of maybe how I'm coming off or am I a weirdo or whatever. But it did kind of realign, I think, what I saw the world as being and what I could do with it versus just other adults making decisions about what drugs I should be on. And something about that helped me.
I mean, it's funny you talk about other adults. I did a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy when I was a teen. And I did like what I guess today has grown into CBIT, but at the time it was cognitive behavioral therapy with habit reversal.
Right.
And it was very effective for some of my really severe OCD symptoms, but it was never especially effective for my tics. And I had a really interesting conversation with a doctor who specializes in CBIT years and years and years later. And the doctor said, how did you choose what tics you were going to focus on with habit reversal training? And I said, well, I didn't. My parents and the doctor decided which tics we were going to focus on. And they said, see, that's why it didn't work for you. They said, you're not guaranteeing that it'll work either way, but like what tics would you have chosen? And it's funny, my parents and the doctor just agreed that we would focus on the barking and the coprolalia. And like those are unpleasant, don't get me wrong, but I would have chosen the tics that hurt instead of the tics that were socially challenging.
Yeah.
And the fact that there was no conversation about that, like that, from what I understand today, you wouldn't really do things that way. You would have a much more involved conversation about where you want to focus, even with a small child. And I was already a teenager.
Yeah.
I think when you talk about parents, one of the other things that only really came up much, much later was that my parents were very, very focused on how the Tourette would affect my life as an adult. And they really didn't understand that as a queer kid in the 90s, I was sort of conscious of the Tourette and I was very aware of how the Tourette would affect my life. But I was also very, very focused on what my life would be like as a gay person. And that was something that my parents never understood as something I really struggled with, not with my identity as a gay person, but as for terms of what that meant in society, because they felt that the Tourette was so all-encompassing of everything. They couldn't understand why I had the mental like space to even think about what it meant to be a gay person compared to what it meant, to be someone with Tourette.
Yeah.
And it just, so my mom and I co-presented a workshop for a conference many years ago called Growing Up Queer from the Parent and Child's Perspective.
Yeah.
And we made a list of topics we were going to cover, but we didn't discuss them at all, so that when we taught the class, we were both coming at each other completely cold. And the Tourette came up as a huge thing that my mom couldn't understand until we taught that class together. And by that point, I was in my 30s. She had never understood how or why being queer mattered so much when I was a kid, because she just couldn't understand thinking about it in the context of what my life would look like when the Tourette was there.
Wow.
Which was, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's weird because I've wondered this, and it always sounds like an ignorant question when I ask it or try to sound it out. But I have talked with other gay Touretters who have had this sort of like seesaw decision of I could live openly as gay, living openly with Tourette seems like something else. Like there's almost been like this sort of like scale of weight of, like I said, this sounds like ignorant in the way I'm asking it, but two things that societally have not been treated so fairly, and having to find that sense of community, trying to find a sense of compass with, so people may not understand this one aspect of my life. Here's this other aspect of my life that's going to be maybe misunderstood or mistreated or judged improperly or something like that. I mean, did you have any conversations with yourself about that, about, the optics of how you're going to live, or had you already kind of decided that, like this is the life I'm going to have, and I'm just going to talk about it comfortably and gain power with that? Or where were you on that kind of thing?
I think Tourette shaped all of that for me, because I've almost since diagnosis had Tourette that couldn't be hidden.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of had to learn to commit very early on to the idea of living my life openly. And it never occurred to me, even, and I came out as queer very young for the time. I came out at 13 in 1993.
Yeah.
Not long after my TS diagnosis, which at the time was super early. Now it's not. It never occurred to me not to live just as openly about being queer as I am about the Tourette, because I was already living a life where I didn't have those kinds of boundaries, because I could never go stealth with the Tourette.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like I was already living a life where the universe said, you don't get to have privacy about who you are and what goes on in your life. And I just sort of said, well, I guess I have to lean into that then, don't I? And I was very, very open about being queer for that reason, I think. But it isn't exactly an easy thing. I mean, I'm married, but I'm in a polyamorous relationship that happened for a very long time, actually, since we got together. So I do date some. And I had a guy say on a dating app, because I'm very, very, very open about the Tourette. It means I get less people who contact me, but on the other hand, better that they bail before we get invested. But I had a guy.
Yeah.
I had a guy who was interested in getting together. And when I explained about the Tourette, he said, I just can't. And he said, look, here's the thing. Being with a guy out in public already draws attention, and some of that attention is already negative. Yeah. And I just don't feel like I can pile onto that by being out with a guy who's already drawing negative attention for something else. He said, like, it's sort of, I'm still getting comfortable with the idea of being out in public with a guy. Being out in public with a guy who's drawing attention to us just isn't something I can do.
Yeah.
And like that sucks to hear.
Yeah.
But I've been bashed. I can understand it. I get it. And, as I say in the job market, it's not that different than the dating market. If you've got a choice between two people and all things are equal, you're going to choose the one who doesn't bark like a dog most of the time. And it's part of why I've been imminently employable, but not so hireable over my lifetime.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard anything as direct as that before about Tourette. I think there have been people in my life, partners who I think don't want to be insulting and don't want to make me feel bad about, or don't want to make me feel worse about something that they think I already feel bad about. But hearing something as directly as I can't add that to my life right now. Like, things are I know what you're saying. Like, I see like how that plays out in the world, but it still sucks at the same time. And I have memories of certain things people have said to me that stuck with me, that kind of hit me, that I didn't expect, when maybe I thought I was in the clear and things were good, and then someone refers to me as socially awkward or something like that. And that sticks to me. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, I thought I was doing better, and here it is again. I learned that I'm kind of like a socially awkward or weird person to talk to, or weird in a charming way, and maybe this is good, but still weird, and that had kind of a psychic blow to me in terms of confidence. Even just small little things like that people might say, even if they're just playing. Did that really hurt, hearing that? And did that kind of realign any perspective? Because on the flip side, I know what you were kind of saying earlier too about, if you get those people out of the way who don't want to roll with someone with TS, then maybe the people remaining are going to be a lot more valuable and helpful to you. So you kind of thin the herd out a little bit, but that would still hurt reading that or hearing that.
So, I mean, I think there is a flip side to it, which is that I don't have to deal with. And that is that I have talked to friends of mine who are, straight cis folk who've encountered people in the dating context who said, like, look, you seem like a great person, but I want to have kids and I don't want it to roll the dice with your genetics because of the Tourette.
I've heard
something I've never had to deal with as a queer person.
Yeah.
And I think, that's something some people are more willing to come out and say. I did my grandmother-in-law at Thanksgiving one day did turn to me and say that my family had failed society by not having me sterilized when I was diagnosed.
Oh my God.
She was not the most pleasant human being on earth.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I pointed out that I wasn't, breeding. But she still felt like it was a failure on my parents' part. So I mean, people hold some pretty wretched attitudes sometimes.
Yeah, that's not my favorite take I've ever heard. No.
But the thing is, I feel like many of my interactions with people are positive, and because the Tourette is a thing that I just have to get out of the way to some degree or another. It does mean that sometimes I can have more rich encounters with people because people feel like I've done something vulnerable when I disclose about the Tourette, which I don't at this point. I feel like I've done something very much rooted in self-preservation. Being really straightforward about the Tourette to me is very much about protecting myself in my interactions with people, because while there's a percentage of people who will be deeply unpleasant to me, even knowing I have a neurological condition, that's something I've definitely discovered, the majority of people are not. And when I can get the TS out of the way, I find that it sort of opens the door for people. People want to share in return, and sometimes that can lead to really awesome, richer encounters.
Right.
I do find that, like, being harassed as I go about my business in public is, as it is for many disabled people, sort of part of what it means for me to move in society. People whip out their phones and film me. People point, people say really nasty things sometimes. I think one of the things I have found for myself, which has been deeply, deeply empowering, is that when I tell someone that I have a neurological condition after they've been unpleasant to me, and that often happens in the form of cards. Whenever I go out in public, I carry 2 cards on me. One are blue bordered, and it says, that I have a neurological condition that causes involuntary movements and sounds. And on the back, there's a short FAQ about Tourette. And then I also carry red bordered ones that say, hi there, you were just an a-hole to someone with a disability. You may not have intended to, but you've made today a little bit worse than it needed to be.
Yeah.
And then on the back is a list of things you might have done that caused you to get this card in your hand. And I will sometimes hand them out together. And one thing I found is that when someone is abusive to me because of the TS, and then I hand them a card and they read it, or I say, I have a disability, or say I have a neurological condition, the interaction very often flips to them apologizing and wanting me to absolve them for their behavior.
Right. Yeah.
And I have made the decision that I am not interested in doing emotional labor to make you feel better about being a crappy person.
Right.
So I often just don't.
Yeah.
And people get very upset when they really want to engage and have a dialogue, and I am not. If our conversation started with you offering me a milk bone, we can assume that from my end, it's going to end there. I don't need to engage with this any further. You can go home and sit and come to a decision and thought process about what it means that's how our interaction worked. But I am not going to assist you in that process.
Was there a sort of like a spark that led to that idea of doing something like that?
My barking had gotten worse. And I was in this place where I had gotten really tired of trying to explain it to everyone. And in-person interactions over the years have gotten like more and more compressed in time scale. And it is easier to do that, to hand over a card, than it is to stop and do a whole explanation. The thing where I found it was most useful was for boarding an airplane. I think that's the inciting thing that caused me to make up the blue cards, was boarding an airplane.
Okay.
Because I can hand a card to the flight attendant at the door and say, I'll write my seat number on it if it's assigned seating. And I'll say, like, just want to let you know. We suddenly say, I want to let you know I have Tourette. I'll hand them the card. Instead of holding up the boarding line, having a 90-second conversation.
Airports are that's definitely a place where I feel on edge. And it's not 100% about being observed or misjudged or anything like that. I mean, that's part of it. It's never happened to me. I've never been pulled out of line or anything like that.
I was denied boarding. I was denied boarding to an aircraft.
What happened?
That was fun. It was a layover, so that's great. And
fun.
I've been sitting in the departure lounge for about an hour, and I've been barking as I'm, reading my book or whatever. And I got into the boarding line and I handed over my boarding pass, and the gate agent set my boarding pass aside and said, I need you to step over there. And a security guard came up, and the very first thing he said was, have you been fed today? That's how the interaction started. And
okay.
I said, is that really an appropriate way to speak to a passenger with a disability? And he said, I'll speak to you however the hell I want.
Oh my God.
And he said, you can't board the plane. And I said, okay, you understand that under the Air Carrier Access Act, you can't deny someone boarding because of a disability.
Yeah.
And he said,
good to know.
Yeah. And he said, it's more complicated than that. But he said, I don't really care. They don't want you on the flight. And I said, all right, all I have is a checked bag. All I have is a carry-on bag. I said, if I'm not getting on the plane, I need to go make other arrangements. And he said, you can't leave.
So,
I said,
so you're being kidnapped.
I said, all right, so I'm going to stand here. And he said, I'll let you on the plane if you can guarantee you won't bark. And I said, well, I have a neurological condition that causes involuntary movements and sounds, so I'm not going to be able to guarantee that. And he said, well, let me go talk to the pilot. So he went and talked to the pilot, came back, and he said, they don't want you on the plane. And I said, all right, then I'm going to leave now. And you will be in violation of the American Disabilities Act and the Air Carrier Access Act. And he said, well, let me think about it. So I stood there. And then he went and he talked to someone else, to some supervisor. And he said, do you take medication? And in retrospect, I shouldn't have even bothered answering. But
Yeah.
I said, I take a pill at night to help me sleep because it suppresses the tics in my sleep. And he said, if you take medication, you can board. And I said, well, I'm not taking my meds now. He said, it doesn't matter. If you have medication, I'll let you on the plane.
Is he your
And
doctor?
Eventually I boarded the plane.
Yeah.
And it was a puddle jumper too. I was going from like New York at that point. I was going from New York to Portland, Maine. And when I was leaving, I said to the pilot when I was deplaning, I said, I want to thank you for letting me on board. I know that we weren't comfortable having me on the flight. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, the security officer said that you didn't want me on the plane. And he said, he came down the ramp and he said, we have someone who barks like a dog and says he has a neurological condition. And I said, well, then you have to let him on the plane.
Yeah.
And I said, that's not what I was told.
Oh my God.
I think he was just flexing his muscle. And I did complain about it to the airline. And the airline eventually said, like, look, it is our job to keep passengers safe. Your behavior was abnormal. And it is appropriate for us to take measures. And I said, yeah, but he spoke to me incredibly insultingly.
Yeah.
All I wanted was an apology. I couldn't get one.
The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to those with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder.
With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports the authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the TS community. To learn more, visit tourette.org, TOURETTE.org.
That is, see, that's such a big thing, I think, for the Tourette community overall, is that I get just quote unquote the outside world's want to be, vigilant and risk averse, and if they see something that looks like a liability, maybe they have to do some kind of intervention with it or investigate or something. But there are so many other ways to do that than to,
Yeah, like, I mean, I've been stopped at like security lines going into an airport all the time, and the interactions have gotten kind of funny because they have like the things they say. So they'll walk through the line of people waiting to go through the security checkpoint, and they'll ask questions, and they get to me, and they'll be asking a lot of questions, and it's gotten to where I'll say, "Don't you just want to ask why I'm barking like a dog?"
Yeah.
And I've had people say, "Well, yeah, obviously that's the reason we want to talk to you," but they're asking all these other questions too. And I've had people say, "Oh, I didn't notice." And at one point, I had someone come up, and he was really grilling me, and he hadn't grilled anyone else. And he said, I said, "Don't you just want to ask me why I'm behind your dog?" And he said, "I hadn't noticed." And the person behind me in line leaned over and went, "Really, really?"
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's very kind of you to say you didn't notice, but we're talking about something here. What about with other ways that you manage it? I mean, so we talked about professionally, you do, video work, and I know you also do photography. So this is the same thing I do for a living. And when I get into work like that, and one of the reasons, I don't know if this is what caused me to get into work like this, it's where I feel at home. It feels good to me. I like making images. I like composing images. And like you said, being an introvert, I'm definitely an introvert. I will talk a lot given the right topic, but I'm definitely an introvert. Don't like being in hectic situations with a lot of people. But if I am working on a video project or doing a photo shoot, that is what I find I enjoy. And I slip into kind of a different role. I think I act differently. I feel a different sense of confidence. And it does have a positive effect on me overall in terms of my ticking, and I think maybe how I come off, if that matters. But do you get any similar benefits from doing this kind of work that is sort of visually creative, or something that taps a certain part of your brain that seems to be satisfied when it comes to something like Tourette? And I'm not speaking scientifically, but just kind of how that can feel.
I mean, I don't tend to tick as much when I'm really focused on what I'm doing, like many Tourettes. So like when I'm doing a photo shoot, when I'm presenting in front of an audience, doing public speaking work, when I'm presenting a video for work, like I don't tend to tick as much. I also don't tend to tick as much on a motorcycle. Although I have had to learn how to tick on a motorcycle, because I gave up motorcycle riding for many years after a tick nearly crashed me.
Oh, wow.
And it took me a long time to get to where I could feel comfortable riding again. I don't tick at a shooting range. I do tick some when I drive. Mm-hmm. But as far as like, I fell in love with photography originally because I loved to write, and the meds that I was on as a teenager just fried my brain. I had no creativity. I couldn't write at all. And even now, I've never been able to get really back to creative writing. And photography was a means of expression I could do that used different parts of my brain, and I could function and do and be creative with. And I'm sort of learning the videography side of things now, which is a weird transition from stills to video. Like, it's one thing setting up a camera to be like a talking head, but I just shot a ton of B-roll for a video I did about the Tesla Model 3. And it was like, oh, this is using some of my knowledge base and some of my skills and not others. And I had this feeling of like, I'm a new guy again, and I don't like that. And I'm a new guy with the same camera in my hand that I'm a really experienced person with.
Yeah.
And that was very like emotionally challenging for me. Same with going from like being an expert in Photoshop and Capture One to trying to learn DaVinci Resolve and being like,
Yeah.
the language is almost the same. But I find that like the vast majority of people with Tourette I know are expressive creativity, creatively. Like some
totally.
It's about music, some it's about other forms of art. And it definitely is something that's really important to me. In fact, one of the things I really like about my relatively new job working for the YouTube company is that I'm no longer making my living with my camera and my presenting, outside of what I do for Transfer Evolved. And I can sort of go back to focusing on passion projects in photography, which feels very indulgent.
That's awesome.
And I do a lot of different kinds of photography, and I really enjoy what I do. And a lot of it's still paying work, but I'm not trying to like, if I don't book a wedding for this month, I'm going to be in trouble financially, which is really nice.
That is nice. I mean, I've kind of gotten to a similar place where I don't want to sound, like all that or anything, but I know a lot of photographers and videographers who do have to worry about that. And they do just kind of go from month to month with a sense of anxiety about the longevity of their finances. And, I have this one project booked. What happens if it gets canceled and I don't get paid? And that's a really, really anxious place to be. With me, I feel I'm really fortunate because, I work for, it's like a salaried day job position doing this kind of work. And then I do some freelance stuff on the outside of that just to, get ahead of my debts, like that kind of thing. But it's very, very liberating to be able to do that and hang on and do something that does, I think, speak the same language as your brain as far as like activities go, and still have that room, that bandwidth to be able to do those passion projects. And I do a lot of art photography as well. And it's the most important part of my life in terms of just me expressing, but me spending time with myself to just kind of process the world by myself and see things in a different way and compose images to make them look the way I want them to look, and just kind of having a say in what the outside world looks like to me. And that's, I think, what I get out of photography from a confidence kind of standpoint. So I feel really fortunate to be able to still have time for these art projects and really enjoy it, in addition to the same technical skill being what I do for a living. It's a really cool position to be in.
And I think that one of the reasons I value doing that kind of thing so much is that I do feel like I live with a sense of lack of control in my daily life. I mean, because I fundamentally don't have the level of control over my body and the level of control over my social interaction that I would choose. We talk a lot about Tourette in the context of like our bodies doing things we don't necessarily consent to, but the Tourette also takes away my ability to have a social interaction go the way I would choose, or at least begin the way I would choose. If I had my druthers, I wouldn't talk to people at the supermarket. I would do my grocery shopping, and then I would exchange pleasantries with the checkout clerk, and then I would get in my car and leave.
Yep.
And that's not a choice I get to make. Like, I can't fly under the radar. I can't guarantee that I'm not going to have to interact with people in that way. And I think that having a creative endeavor like photography, I feel like in photography, I can make other people see the world the way I choose.
Yes.
Even if just in that one moment. It's my perspective, and I'm in the driver's seat from start to finish. And that's a feeling that I don't get to have in just life.
Right.
Because, to some extent, the Tourette shapes all of that.
That is such a good way of saying it, that when I'm doing something like this, and I guess to relate it to anybody listening, this probably applies to other people's creative pursuits, like you were saying in this audience, like creativity is such a huge thing. So there's a lot of musicians, there's a lot of visual artists. And when I am doing either of those things, I do music as well, but when I do either of those things, I feel things in my mind, and maybe everybody does, but I feel things in my mind that don't feel like they have it's like a sense of victory or something. I don't know what over, but it has that same appeal that exactly I don't get to feel in my day-to-day social interactions. When I go in and to the coffee shop and I buy a cup of coffee, I feel really self-conscious, and how am I coming off? How did I say this? Do I sound like I don't know what I'm doing? And that's always going through my head, but it's not when I'm doing something like a creative activity that I feel really passionate about. And so it is just a total break from the pressures of the world or the pressures I put on myself because maybe I'm not living up to what the world needs me to be or something like that. It's just all that's gone.
I think it's also why you see a lot of people with Tourette who go into athletic pursuits, in terms of like in a related way, where you get people who really devote themselves to martial arts or a sport or weightlifting. Though I guess weightlifting counts as a sport, that sort of thing, because it's just looking for some control over one's body in a different way, a way of saying like, well, sure, the tics aren't in my control, but I can assert control of my body in another way.
Yeah.
It's something that I actually feel about my tattoos, that like to some degree getting tattooed and other body mods for me has been about asserting a sense of control over my body that I sort of automatically don't feel. And I realized that like talking about me and my body as separate things is fundamentally not very healthy. It's something that I have tried to work on. And I think it's very natural to sort of think in that way as someone with Tourette. And it's just, 27, 28 years of having Tourette. And it's not something I've managed to sort of get past, the sort of identity of self and body as separate. I think that's a challenge for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. But I feel like for people with TS, it's definitely a particular struggle, or can be.
Yeah. And this is, I guess being careful about how I say this, because I don't want to sound like it's what people call inspiration porn or anything like that. But, when we do have these challenges, it's like, one thing kind of affects another thing. And there are people who don't have Tourette, but have, another kind of challenge, and they found some kind of order of operations or an activity in their life that takes them out of it for a second. But it is a unique experience to be misunderstood at the same time. And I like the way that we've barely scratched the surface. We've been talking for an hour now, and this has really flown by, but the way you've described all of this and the way that I've been able to relate to it so quickly, I feel like it's going to translate to a lot of people as well. I think it's really good for the queer community in the audience to hear this, because there are contextual challenges that can come on top of Tourette syndrome, whether it's a regional thing or a lack of resources, or just who you are, if that's something that consensus society or convention, I guess, historically hasn't centered around. And you do have a sense of command that I think is awesome, that I think I hear self-acceptance when you talk. I mean, are you there with that? Like, how I know I can live my life, it may be different from the advice I would give you to live yours, but this is what I've got. I mean,
see, I think that's one of those things I never wasn't. It was never presented to me any other way, just because of, I think, really how my family approached the Tourette.
Yeah.
And I think that my experience would have been different if I had had prolonged periods of time where I could have been stealth about the Tourette. But since I just didn't, it was just something, that I had to accept and figure out how to move on with.
Yeah.
That said, I feel like I'm supposed to be one of those people who says, like, if someone offered me a pill tomorrow to make the Tourette go away, I'd say no.
Right.
And no, I wouldn't say no.
Right.
I have a great deal of chronic pain from the Tourette.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of physiological challenges. I have a lot of social challenges. If someone said like, "Hey, I've got a magic wand, it'll take away the Tourette," if it was it'll take away the Tourette from this moment on, I would say yes. If it was it'll go back in time and you never will have had Tourette, I would say no, because I'm so much of who I am and how I live my life is a product of growing up with Tourette. I wouldn't reject it in that way. But if my tics could stop tomorrow, I'd be on board with that. I feel like that's bad disability advocacy speak, but at the same time, like owning our truths, I have a lot of pain from my tics.
Yeah.
And it would be really nice to be able to go, to the grocery store without fear. I mean, I'm about to do probably the most dramatic lifestyle change I've ever done. I'm about to move 3,200 miles away from where I grew up.
Yeah.
I live about 200 miles away from where I grew up now. I'm about to move to the West Coast. And one of the things that's challenging for me about moving anytime I move is that I feel like I know the stores around here that have gone out of their way to be safe and welcoming to me. And I know the stores that haven't. And having to figure all that out again from scratch is daunting. Likewise, I'm moving into an apartment complex after years and years and years of living in a house.
Yeah.
So now there's also like explaining about the Tourette to everybody I bump into at like the hot tub or at the fitness center and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that is also daunting. But it's not something I have any choice about. And it's something I've got many, many, many years of learning how to do gracefully. So hopefully it'll go smoothly. We'll see.
Yeah. And to go back to what you were saying about the pill and, what would I, if I could just wash it out of my system right now, would I do it? No judgment at all. When you said, like, that sounds like bad disability advocacy, I know where you're coming from on that, but I know you have your own context, your own life, your own decisions. And as much as I want, solidarity with a group of people so we can, raise all the boats and everything like that, I still want to feel like I'm in the right context and I'm in the right place with my life. And that's a really great answer, the way you answered it. It's so ingrained in me and has affected, who knows, maybe every decision I've ever made in some way, but Tourette is a very, very profound thing. And it leads you to all kinds of thinking exercises and what if this and what if that, and the depression and anxiety and sleep and things like that, issues that can come with it. You're constantly a tornado of thoughts in your head, or you can be. And so there are all kinds of things that I don't like about Tourette syndrome. Would I go back and undo it back in time? No, because I feel like so many of the positives I have in my life are also from it. And I guess that's just kind of my analogy for everybody else in the world, that, maybe I think my neighbor over there is completely quote unquote neurotypical and has a quote unquote normal way of life, but maybe there's something about him that I don't know and he's not talking about. And something about that, maybe the hypothetical of that, kind of gives me some sense of comfort when it comes to me being a little bit off or different, or how I evaluate myself. But again, talking with people like you and, learning how much I have in common with you, and that there are things you think that, I think before I started the podcast, there were things where I'm like, I'm the only person thinking this way, or I'm the only person who has this tic, or, like, is this even Tourette? Do I even have it? Do I, then you connect with people and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is real. I think the exact same thing. And so with people getting, there are people getting newly diagnosed with Tourette, and it can be kind of fearful. I think parents may have a big sense of anxiety about their child's future if it's a new diagnosis. And sometimes I get emails from parents asking, very worried questions about what's my son or daughter's future going to be like. And do you, just kind of looking back at your life and how your parents handled it, how you handled it, medication, all that stuff, what would you say to a parent who is just coming into this and it's kind of a new universe and maybe kind of uncertain and kind of scary? What would you say about outcomes and, the ability of someone with Tourette syndrome to live as fulfilling of a life as the guy down the block who maybe I don't know? That's kind of a huge question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I definitely have a few thoughts. Pardon me. So that looks really fun in the waveform.
I'm looking at it too. Yeah.
So, there's several thoughts that come to mind about what I would say to a parent of a child who is newly diagnosed, or to someone who is just newly diagnosed themselves. The first thing that comes to mind is that, again, I sort of feel like a bad TS advocate here, and it's one of the places where I think historically the TAA and I have not always agreed on things. Mm-hmm. It is okay to embrace the idea that your life or your child's life is not going to just look like everyone else's. And it's okay to acknowledge and embrace that there may be things that that child can't do, or ways that their life will not be as easy or good as if they didn't have TS. And the sort of relentless drumbeat of you can just be a normal person, live a normal life, I think is really corrosive to those of us who can't. It's funny. I think of it as the classic Tourette syndrome isn't just coprolalia. Obviously, that's an important fact, and it's true. But the way that is sometimes conveyed can be extremely sort of othering and disempowering for people who do have coprolalia.
Yes, completely agree. We can be cruel to ourselves within this own community of saying, of assuring the outside world that I have Tourette syndrome, but it's not that kind. That, I know you've seen that on TV, but that's not me. You don't have to worry about that. And in the process of doing that, you're completely marginalizing and insulting people who do have to
I know a family. I know a family. All three of their kids have TS. Some of them very significantly, and the parent was asked to stop going to parent support groups for parents of kids with TS because their experience were scaring the other parents who were, afraid that their kid could end up like this person's kid, and that wasn't good for anybody because one, that parent now doesn't have support, and two, that could happen. So I think that getting it out there that people with Tourette can live very fulfilling, very happy lives. And many of us, not me, but many of us can live very normal lives. Mm-hmm. But that's going to be a roll of the dice, whether or not that's on the table. And I think one of the hardest things to grasp for newly diagnosed people and for parents and for partners of people with Tourette is that things change so much. Mm-hmm. So I follow a Tourette syndrome group on Reddit, and one of the things that I see with some frequency is people getting into their 20s saying like, I still tick. When is this going to go away?
Yeah.
Because for so long, we sort of hammered the idea that people's tics are worse in adolescence and then they get better or go away.
Right.
Or what happens to some people where their tics virtually disappear and they think, I'm done. That sucked. It's over.
Yeah.
And then 3, 4, 5 years later, they start to wax again, sometimes less, sometimes more. And that can be extremely distressing. I had one really hard waxing period, and I didn't tell people about the Tourette for a period of time. It was my one time in my life I was sort of stealth for about 2 years in college. And then my tics just came back really badly. And I had to suddenly explain to people who knew me what the hell was going on. So I think that awareness that Tourette is so unpredictable is really valuable.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think is really valuable and really hard for parents to hear, it was something that my mother really, really struggled to hear, is that there's this idea of we're all in it together. And that's great. I mean, having supportive parents is amazing. But you'll never get it fully the way your kid does, or your partner. I've run into this with people I've dated who's like, well, I understand what it's like to have Tourette. I've been living with you for years. And it's like, no, you don't. You understand what it's like to live with me.
Exactly.
You understand what it's like to be around someone with Tourette, but that's still not remotely the same as the internal experience of Tourette. And I see that sometimes come up with parents around anxiety around Tourette, where parents will say like, I worry just as much as you about what your tics mean, or, I struggle just as hard as you. And that's not healthy. And I think we see that some in advocacy groups. I don't actually know a lot about the modern TAA, but I see that in my work with other people with other disabilities and other disability advocacy groups, where a lot of disability advocacy groups are sort of by and for parents rather than the people with the disability.
Yeah.
And because of that, that affects the narrative in ways that can be very appropriating on the part of the person who experiences someone's condition, but from the outside, in a way that I think is challenging. Of course, you and I we're really the earliest generation of people diagnosed as kids. When I was growing up and I was around people with Tourette, I was around adults with Tourette at conferences and stuff, it was almost universal that they were diagnosed as adults. Actually getting diagnosed as a kid was extremely rare. And I think that has really changed the nature of Tourette advocacy work over the last, 35 or 40 years. As it's gone from, in the very beginning, there wasn't a lot of focus on parents because kids weren't being diagnosed.
Right.
It was really, a gathering of adults, and that has shifted. And I think kids getting diagnosed is a really good thing. The other thing I'm going to mention is don't keep it from your kid. I'm amazed when people bring that up, like, oh, my child was diagnosed with Tourette, but we don't want to tell them.
I get that question a lot. Yeah.
And that absolutely frustrates the hell out of me. Because kids aren't, ignorant to their surroundings and their peers and what's happening in their life. If your kid has symptoms enough that they've been diagnosed, they know.
Yeah.
And they know that their friends don't, and their friends know that they do. And there's a whole thing going on there that you may not be privy to, and keeping it from them is so problematic. And I think there's an idea that if we don't tell kids, then they won't be stigmatized.
Yeah.
But the reality is that children can be unbelievably cruel. They can also be weirdly compassionate. I have found that explaining Tourette to school kids, when I explain Tourette to like first graders, they get it in a way that junior high schoolers have to have it spelled out for them. But I think about, like, I was teaching a workshop, and I had a group of first and second graders, and I explained about Tourette, and they were seeing me tick. And I said, now, can anyone tell me what they think living with Tourette might be like? And like the very first kid who raised his hand said, well, you might not be able to go to a movie theater. And I said, that's right. I actually can't go to movie theaters.
Yeah.
And someone else said, people might look at you funny. And it was this whole like really insightful conversation. And like a month later, I was speaking to a group of junior high schoolers, and I had someone who raised their hand and said, I don't know, it looks like it'd be kind of fun. Which is, man,
it's interesting.
Yeah. But, kids can be very cruel. And if your kid is different, children are going to latch onto that, and they're going to call that out.
Yeah.
And if they don't know why they're different, that's going to be even harder for them. And it doesn't give their friends and fellow children a chance to be different.
Yes. I it's like I was saying, I get this question a lot, and I think you addressed this. Like, I get where that idea comes from of, it, it's not going to go to your head if you just have no idea it exists or something. But it's a very untrue way of looking at it. Like, you become painfully aware of what's different about you versus other people. And, I've talked with plenty of people who were diagnosed as adults because they didn't have support as a kid, or their parents were like, it's just, or maybe they did go to a doctor, but the doctor was like, oh, this is just, all kids have this kind of thing. It goes away. Don't worry about it. All kids tick. But growing up without that definition, every time I talk to an adult who got diagnosed later in life and always wondered what was up with them, I won't say every, because I don't want to generalize. I don't want to say every single adult, but I guess I am generalizing. But it's they've liked that answer of this. I thought this is maybe what it was, but I didn't. I watched a special on it on TV, and it didn't match up with what I had. But now that I have this answer, I feel like it's opened all kinds of doors for me to learn myself, and that's not something that. I'm sure it's a relief when that happens, but that's not something that you want to happen, kind of late in life. I feel even though I grew up with that sense of shame about my TS, and it's a good point that you brought up, because my ability to mask, there were times where I couldn't mask. I couldn't be stealth about it, but my ability to cover it up a lot of time, or turn my tics into something else that looks a little bit more natural, like adding a certain move to it, like I was yawning or stretching or something. And maybe that ability did do me some damage in not accepting myself or having the conversation with my friends about what I'm doing. But just having that definition and having that sense of home and community, as long as the community also realizes that, you need to be yourself too. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but everything you said really, I think, hits home in the right way. I can't tell anybody how to be a parent because I'm not credible. I don't have any kids myself, but if that question does come up of, do I tell my son or daughter about the diagnosis? I mean, for me, it's always, yeah. And there are all kinds of positive things that can come with it too, and all kinds of people you can connect with, and different ways you can look at your life.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, because the nature of my tics, some of these are conversations that are very academic for me. They're ones that I can't really understand.
Yeah.
Because they're just outside of my experience. One of the things I find so interesting about Tourette is that, like, everyone's Tourette is different. But then when you get us together, we have some really shared experiences. And I have noticed often a shared sense of humor. The time I've been like at a conference with I went out once at a biennial conference. It was me, my husband, who does not have TS, and 4 or 5 other like 20 somethings at the time with Tourette. And it was fun, all of us on the DC Metro. But it was really obvious that we all had these sort of shared perspectives and traits. There was something that, not just shared experience, that sort of helped connect us. That was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by the sort of phenomenon of Tourette and Tourette community online.
Yeah.
But it also has been, the online community is, in some ways, it can be hard for me. It can be dispiriting for me, because I was so lucky. My mom was a special education teacher. My stepdad was a guidance counselor. My dad was a teacher. And I lived in central Massachusetts, where there were some very, very, very good medical resources available to me. I mean, yeah. I saw Ruth Brun in New York when she was on the National TS Medical Advisory Board. I've been seeing Dr. Schaaf, Jeremiah Schaaf, who's on the TAA's Medical Advisory Board. I've had access to really good resources all along, and it's spending time on the internet. It's so frustrating to me sometimes to see how bad the resources are for so many people in so many parts of the country and the world. Still, conversations that I was having 15, 20 years ago, and misunderstandings. I mean, today, if you're diagnosed today and go to a TS specialist, the odds are good that they are going to assess your tics and the potential side effects of medication and make a medication decision based on quality of life.
Yeah.
That's sort of the guidance. But I still see people who are being diagnosed as like, I was diagnosed with Tourette, I have eye blinking and I sniff, and the doctor says I need to start haloperidol.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's so outdated. Or you see people, especially young people, who are saying like, I'm diagnosed with Tourette, but my parents don't understand it and they keep punishing me for ticking. And I don't know how to explain it to them. And I just think, like, when I was diagnosed, my mom ordered every book that you could buy from the Tourette Syndrome Association. Mm-hmm. We went away on vacation, and that's the only reading material she brought. Now, granted, she had enormous privilege. She, A, had a week's vacation, B, had a master's degree in special education and knew how to read this stuff, C, knew it existed, and D, could afford to buy 10 books or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But she just binge read every piece of information from stuff for parents to medical journals. And in a week, she used to say, in a week, she knew 90% of what she would ever know about Tourette.
Wow.
And, that was as someone who would go on to, be one of the two people who wrote the educator's curriculum that the TSA, then TA, designed to deploy in schools. And because of that, I never had to sort of deal with parents who just absolutely didn't get, although there were still some things that they struggled with. But that was all before really the internet. I mean, 1993, I think we had AOL dial-up.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds right.
We didn't even have a dedicated phone line for it. So,
somebody picks up the phone to make a call, you're done.
You're done. So, I mean, today with all the access to information that's out there, the fact that we're still, having parents telling their kids to stop ticking, the fact that we're still having doctors who are saying like, oh, we'll just try to medicate the tics away. And I mean, I've had those conversations. I saw a neurologist for migraines, and he wanted to start me actually on Haldol. And I said, actually, Haldol's not really a frontline treatment for Tourette anymore. And I took it when I was a kid, and it didn't work, and I don't need it. And he said, well, I learned about that in medical school. What do you do for a living? And I had to pull out my Tourette specialist. I literally brought up my phone. I wrote down the contact information for the world-renowned Tourette doctor that I saw. And I said, here's Dr. Schoff's contact info. If you want to talk to him about it and he agrees that I should do that, then I'll do that. But until then, I'm going to stick with the person who's made Tourette his life's work. And that was me at that point in my 30s. How hard is it for someone who doesn't have that knowledge, who doesn't have an expert in their corner, who doesn't, for whom this is all new? And it's hard sometimes. Sometimes I find myself stepping back from online community because I can't believe we're still having some of the same conversations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What's the running time here now? We're at
an hour and 23 minutes.
Hour and 20 minutes. It feels like it's been 30. And,
no, absolutely.
It's the way you've, I think, encapsulated so many things here has been really, really helpful, because I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but at the same time, we've kind of been in a good groove of being really succinct with, I think, some pretty dynamic challenges for the Tourette community, and things that I'm still learning about that. I'm still, even though I've been living with Tourette syndrome pretty much my whole life, I'm still green. I'm green to a lot of this stuff. The community aspect of it, the present day needs of the overall disabilities community, and the language we should be using. And I mean, I feel like I've learned so much in the past. So when this podcast started, it was 3.5 years ago, talking to people like you who have a better way of, and more succinct way of coming to these points than I've had, I think, historically. And I'm trying to get there with that sense of comfort and knowledge to where I don't have to just kind of have conversations and talk. I can feel a little bit more confident in maybe what I can do solution wise. And that's, I think, my, evolving goal. And it all comes from getting a better compass by talking to people like you. And this has really been great. Is there anything that maybe I didn't ask about that you think's important, or something that maybe we were going toward but we got away from that you wanted to say? Or I just want to make sure, when we wrap this up, it's not without something that you thought was important that didn't go said.
So I don't know if you'll be able to use this, but I have a really funny piece of understanding neurology about coprolalia.
Okay.
So I had really bad coprolalia growing up. Really complex coprolalia, but really significant coprolalia. And after the product design firm I founded out of college eventually folded because the Great Recession happened to all of us, I ended up teaching and doing workshops in the adult entertainment world. And I eventually ended up being an event producer in that world. And my coprolalia, it basically went away. And I realized years later that I actually still had coprolalia, but it wasn't recognizably coprolalia. Because of course, coprolalia is socially inappropriate words and phrases.
Yeah.
And I got this fascinating explanation of the neurology of it. So what I was told, and again, I am not a neurologist, but what I was told was that basically we have language, which is what we speak with, and then we have non-linguistic sounds. So like I bark like a dog, that's a non-linguistic sound.
Mm-hmm.
And when kids are young, they intersperse non-linguistic sounds and speech all the time. You spend time around a 3 or 4 year old, they're going to bark or growl or whatever. That's, or scream, they're kids. And we tell them, no, use your words. And as we're doing that, we're helping them sort language from non-linguistic sounds.
Yeah.
And obscenities, because we're taught not to say them, they tend to get put into non-linguistic sounds, which is why for many people, it takes a slight bit of effort in the scheme of their speech to throw in an obscenity. You have to have some intentionality behind it. But I was working in a field where the most common obscenities in sort of polite society, which tend to revolve around things like sex acts, were part of my normal conversation. They were part of my work. They were,
right.
I mean, if I'm writing an event program for an adult entertainment event, I'm going to be having conversations with my boss, the event producer, about what kind of language we want to use. And as a consequence of that, obscenities got moved more and more from non-linguistic sounds to language. And coprolalia doesn't really hit language. It hits non-linguistic sounds with the rest of the Tourette. It's why coprolalia can be socially inappropriate words and phrases in context.
Yeah.
Because there's some things we shouldn't say in context. And in the sort of active hierarchy of how our brain sorts stuff, it moves the thing you shouldn't say into non-linguistic sounds, which is why someone with coprolalia might then say it.
Yeah.
So I had this whole extended period of time where I wasn't yelling obscenities because I was yelling, monkey, because monkey is completely random.
Yeah.
And it's always pretty much socially inappropriate unless you're at the zoo.
Sure.
But I wasn't going to yell obscenities because those were just parts of conversation for me because they were parts of work.
Yeah.
And after I left that job, and as I've been transitioning to working in a much more mainstream field, I may work in electric vehicle journalism now, it isn't appropriate in most contexts for me to be using obscenities. And my coprolalia has been getting more recognizably coprolalia because now I do sometimes yell an obscenity because that's not a word that's just part of my normal conversation anymore.
Yeah.
Because brains are profoundly weird.
Yeah. I kind of thought you were going to say, being in an environment where, like certain words are not necessarily taboo or, not unheard of. I was kind of expecting you to say that your brain was going to get you to do something that was kind of counter to being in that environment, like you're shouting out Bible verses or, just.
So that is a huge issue.
Yeah.
In the world that I traveled in and still do some, there are words that you would say to declare that something needs to stop or that something is an emergency. So, the idea of safe words is something that have sort of made its way into modern cultural conversation. And in certain environments, there are universal safe words. And if you yell that, everything in the environment you're in has to stop right now because it means someone is in distress.
Yeah.
And I work as a photographer still, even though I don't teach as often, still do some, and I don't do event production there. I still work as a photographer in that environment. And even though I tend to not tick as much when I'm focused on the camera, I have found that I have had to leave that environment because the risk of me yelling a universal safe word is too high.
Oh,
and it would disrupt everyone.
Yeah.
Because that's classic coprolalia. If you're in that environment, the one word you never say is red. And I want to, I'm trying not to yell red.
Yeah.
It's much the same as, going into an airport.
Yeah, the B word.
You have to be very conscious of coprolalia around the TSA.
Yeah.
But
the other TSA.
The other TSA. But yeah, that is also very much an issue. Like if I'm in the supermarket and I yell red, that doesn't mean anything to anyone. No one cares. But if I'm at this kind of event and I yell red, I've now disrupted everyone's evening by it is the equivalent of pulling the fire alarm.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was picturing, is like you yanking the fire alarm down.
Yeah. And that is because brains are so weird that there things that you would think of as coprolalia in that environment would be, no one would care whatsoever.
Yeah.
But an innocuous name of a color, that would be a disaster.
Wow. So I sent a friend a meme. This is a couple of years ago, who was kind of, I guess, wondering about the urge to tick. And the one I've always said on the podcast is like, it's like, try not to blink, hold your eyes open and don't blink and see how long you can do it. You're going to have this urge and you're going to have to do it at some point. And that was like the best analogy I could think of at the time or I'd heard at the time for, what's it like to tick and the urge to do it, especially in a certain environment where you're not supposed to. And the meme I sent was, it's like, this is kind of relatable. You might get it this way, is the meme of, I think the caption said something like, when you're in an antique store and your mom tells you not to touch anything, then it's the picture of E.T. with the long finger, like getting ready to poke something. It's kind of like this in a way. It's not exactly, you're not going to get a full picture, but just kind of vibe off this for a little bit, because it's kind of how it feels. Like
I can see that.
Yeah, it's like there's just something. It's like one thing casts light on the opposite of, if I'm in this environment, here's a word I'm not supposed to say. Okay, so all of a sudden this word has a highlighter around it now, and now I'm thinking about it. Here it is. And I don't have coprolalia. I've never dealt with that. There are phrases that I do say that kind of feel good and have a percussive kind of effect, like a tick might. And I get that same sense of, I guess, satisfaction, quote unquote. But I definitely relate to how these urges kind of rise to the top and the environment created for them. Why and all that stuff, then, I'm not a scientist, but it's one of these things that I always feel like I have to be aware of, even though I don't have coprolalia. If I'm in an airport, the B word that you're not allowed to say,
does it sort of beat on the inside of your lips?
Yeah, it kind of knocks on the door. Yeah. And just, we're here, we can say this, we're conscious of this, here's the word. You're not supposed to say it, but I know you're going to. And I don't. And I haven't exactly worked that part out of being conscious of coprolalia. Or I've heard people say, do you have ticks inside your head where you don't pronounce it, but it's a certain word that just repeats? I guess I relate to that. I don't really know what that is, if that's something everybody does or what, but
that's where you're getting into that incredibly gray, fuzzy area between Tourette and OCD.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny. I was talking to a neuroscientist about this, who said, like, look, right now we say that there's Tourette and comorbid condition with Tourette. You have Tourette, OCD, ADHD, executive function stuff, autism spectrum disorder, all sort of comorbid, and you can have them in any sort of combination. And he said, look, I think right now that's how we structure them, because we look at these conditions on a symptomological level. But he said, I think as genetics research gets better and better, we're eventually going to come to a place where we're going to have to give that cluster of things a name and then talk about it in terms of how it expresses. He said, I think we're going to find that genetically there's much less, it's much harder to say that's Tourette, that's OCD on a genetic level, as opposed to this is the Tourette, the way it expresses as Tourette versus the way it expresses OCD. And I think it'd be interesting to see where that science goes. Because I mean, as someone with OCD and Tourette, I definitely find that, like, there are times where I'll say, like, was that a tick? Was that a compulsion? Was that obsession? Like, how do you classify that? And I used to really worry about it. I used to really think, like, it's important to me to figure out what this is. And I've gotten to a place where I'm just like, it's my brain. Like, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, in much the same way that the premonitory urge, the feeling before a tick, it's different for different ticks of mine. Not all my ticks have them. Like, a lot of my more physical ticks, they happen when I know, like, I'll notice, oh, I'm ticking. Whereas some of my more vocal ticks, I'm much more conscious of the premonitory sensation. And some of them, I can use that awareness to suppress that tic, at least for a period of time.
Yeah.
And some of them, it's more like, well, that's a little bit of a heads up for me. And then there's room in between. Because I think that whenever we try to talk about like, what does a tic feel like? For me, my different tics can feel very, 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 very different.
For sure.
Because Tourette just doesn't make all that much sense. I mean, when push comes to shove, it's an incredibly hard condition to sort of classify. And I think that's part of why it's so hard for society in terms of acceptance. And I think it's why it's so hard for parents and partners and family members, because it's so hard, if not impossible, to ever put a box around it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been barking like a dog since 1993, although arguably I don't sound that much like a dog anymore. But I have other tics that I had for 6 months and are gone. I have tics that go and come back, like this ridiculous means of speaking. And that's all just me. I know people with Tourette whose tics are totally different. My favorite is I have a friend with Tourette. So a lot of people's tics look like other actions. We talk about complex motor tics as being a tic that's actually another action. And my favorite is I have a friend who tugs at his shirt on his chest. And he's transgender. He was assigned female at birth. And it was years I knew him before I was like, oh, that tic is the gesture someone does when they adjust their bra. And he said, yeah. He said, I had that tic when I had a chest. And I had chest surgery 15 years ago, and I still have that tic.
Wow.
Because it's just, and that's a tic that wouldn't necessarily even be noticed by someone if he still had his chest.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's like he may not have even noticed was a tic at the time, until the circumstances changed and suddenly it became obvious that, oh, this motion is a tic after all.
That is interesting. That is so interesting. This is, I'm never not going to be fascinated by this stuff. I mean, I'm not trying to be like Tourette centric or anything like that. All of this, just like you were saying, it's hard to really fence this in with a definition, or I know there is a definition, but when it comes to, seeing it on the ground and the nuance and everything like that, it's difficult to box in, but that just makes it all the more interesting to me. The dynamics and diversity of how Tourette expresses itself, and the different ways people prefer to manage it and live their lives, whether they do go through the trials of medication or do something a little bit more interesting or personal, or I don't know, but it's been so fun talking with you. And I have a feeling this is something we could do again and just kind of pick right up, because it's been very easy to dig into this.
I'd love to come back. I'd be delighted to talk to you again. This is a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much to Winter Tashlin for joining us. There has to be a continuance episode at some point. If there's something you want to hear us talk more about or explore more, or if there was a hint of a subject coming up that we never quite fleshed out, let me know. Whatever you want to hear more of, tourettespodcast@gmail.com, or you can use the contact form at tourettespodcast.com. Or go to the discussion group on Facebook. You can look it up, or you can find the link to it at tourettespodcast.com. This podcast is made possible with support from the Tourette Association of America, online at tourette.org, with all kinds of resources and webinars and information for kids, for parents, for adults, and providers alike. And you can see everything on their schedule at tourette.org. Geeks Rising is the podcast network that extends Tourette's podcast and related awareness to a general listening audience, for which I'm so massively grateful. The people at Geeks Rising are some of the nicest and most supportive people I've ever talked to, and you can find all the past episodes of Tourette's podcast there at geeksrising.com. Patreon.com/Tourette's podcast. If you want to give a cup of coffee level of support to the show, I appreciate everyone giving support, including Christopher Muty from the UK, who gets an executive producer title for that support. Thanks, Chris. We're almost to the halfway point of season 7, unbelievably. And we have so much more exciting stuff coming up. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and we'll be back with another episode. This is Ben.